Working from home, you feel so alone. Cabin fever's running high. 5 o'clock comes, it's happy hour, but all you do is sigh. When the cocktail hit the spot, it's time to just relax, mix up a bit of history. Go ahead, put the kids to bed, and please drink responsibly. Join me for happy hour history. Hello friends, Kim McCann here, program developer at Prairie, and welcome to another episode of Happy Hour History, where we mix up some historical cocktails and talk about alcohol-related history. This episode, our featured spirit is rye. Now, rye is a whiskey, and much like bourbon is also a whiskey, it has specific components that it needs to have to be classified as rye. Just like bourbon needs to be composed of 51% corn grain, rye needs to be composed of 51%, you guessed it, rye. Just like bourbon, it is aged in new charred oak barrels, and it needs to be distilled and bottled at no lower than 80 proof. The origins of rye whiskey is really an immigration story. When Scotch and Irish settlers first came to the East Coast, they intended to distill just like they always had in their home countries. Now, Irish and Scotch whiskeys are largely composed of barley, but barley didn't grow very well in North America. So those farmers and distillers turned to rye, which happened to grow really well, and rye whiskey was born. Rye whiskey was wildly popular as rum, which was the drink of choice in early America, became more and more expensive because of the Sugar Act and taxation. Rye really rose to prominence. We think of bourbon as being the true American whiskey, but rye really had it up on bourbon in the early days. In fact, in 1810, Kentucky was producing about 2.2 million gallons of bourbon. In Pennsylvania and Maryland, they were producing about 6 million gallons of rye. The death knell for rye really came with World War I and World War II, when the government subsidized corn farmers. Corn yielded more and grew faster than rye, and therefore it became the crop of choice for farmers. Rye was grown less, became more expensive, and rye whiskey fell to corn whiskey. We're gonna mix up a couple cocktails today using rye from Hotel Tango, which is a local distillery. They make very fine product and they're open for curbside service. They've been kind enough to share some of their product with us, so thank you, Hotel Tango. So the first cocktail we're gonna mix up is a classic. It's called the Rock and Rye. It has a pretty interesting origin story. In 1877, the New York Sun newspaper printed an article where former Judge Ellis Schnabel told his story about how he had cured himself of tuberculosis in 1849 by drinking a concoction that he called Rock and Rye. Tuberculosis was a real problem in the mid-19th century. People were scared. People didn't really understand how you contracted TB, and so they latched on to almost anything that they thought would help them get better. Judge Schnabel said that he consumed, over the course of 18 months, about 22 gallons of a mixture of rye whiskey that had been mixed with rock sugar candy. Did it work? I don't know, but people were down for it. It became extremely popular, and within months, bottlers were selling something called Rock and Rye. Pharmacies caught on. They added herbs and citrus, which were thought to be healthsome, and started selling the bottled concoction in pharmacies. Calling it medicine, they avoided some of the tax on alcohol, so it was pretty popular for quite some time. The original recipe is pretty simple. 1 tablespoonful of rock candy syrup and 1 wine glass of rye whiskey. The original recipe also states this is often prescribed for a cold. Well, certainly people have some health issues that they might be looking at or dealing with, so let's see how that actually works. We're going to use, in place of rock candy syrup, we're going to use some of that jacked up simple syrup that I made. Basically 2 parts sugar to 1 part water, processed like a regular simple syrup, brought to a boil, simmered down until the sugar melts. So we're going to add that to our glass here, and then a wine glass full, which we know is 2 ounces of rye. Then we mix that up. That's a Rock and Rye. Now, I've tasted this and I can tell you that it's really just sweetened rye. And if you want to drink that, that's fine. I don't know that it'll cure your cold or tuberculosis or any other diseases that are going around, but it'll certainly help you sleep. Now, when I heard that there was a cocktail called the Rock and Rye, I was a little surprised because when I think of Rock and Rye, I revert back to my childhood. I grew up in Michigan, where in 1907, brothers Ben and Prairie Fagenson opened the Fagenson Brothers Bottling Works. In 1921, they changed the name of their company to Faygo, and they produced pop, or soda. During Prohibition, the company pushed out flavors that were a nod to several original cocktails, which were now prohibited. And one of those flavors was Rock and Rye. Now that got me thinking. I wondered if I could turn the original Rock and Rye that we just made here into something a little more akin to the soda that I grew up drinking. And here's what I came up with. To this Rock and Rye, which is 2 ounces of rye and 1 ounce of simple syrup, I'm going to add 1 ounce of vanilla brandy, which is basically brandy that I had a vanilla pod, and I put that in the bottle and let it steep for a couple weeks. And then 1 ounce of cherry liqueur. Top that with soda water, club soda. Add a little bit of lemon. Give it a stir. That's good. Now, you might have noticed that I referred to carbonated beverages as both pop and soda. I'm from Michigan originally, but lived for a long time on the West Coast, and so I grew up calling it both things. The lines between pop and soda and who calls it what are very clearly delineated by geography. And here's the reason why. In the 1700s, European scientists figured out how to impregnate mineral water with carbon dioxide gas, and that's when the soft drink was born. Soft drink as opposed to a hard drink, with alcohol or without alcohol. Now, these soft drinks were thought to be healthsome, and they spurned a whole movement and created soda fountains, where you could go and get this carbonated beverage. As Europeans settled in America, those soda fountains popped up along the East Coast. By 1780, kits to create your own soda fountain business were even created. Then the next big thing happened. In the early 20th century, the bottle making machine was first patented. Heretofore, any bottles were hand blown, and that meant daily production was around 1,400. After the bottle making machine was created, bottle production jumped to about 50,000 bottles a day, which meant that it was a lot cheaper to bottle something. And once somebody figured out how to cork it and cap it the right way, those bottles could be transported. And so they moved to the Midwest. So in the East and in the West, where Europeans settled, we had soda from soda fountains. But in the Midwest, where that bottled carbonated beverage was transported, we had pop. A lot of linguistics agree that the word pop, when referring to a carbonated beverage, is just an onomatopoeic synonym for the sound that cork makes when it's taken out of the bottle. Well, with that linguistic riddle solved, we're going to move on to our final cocktail for the episode. A classic rye cocktail called the Manhatten. And like many classic cocktails that stand the test of time, they also generate lots of stories as to their origin. We're going to stick with what's probably the most likely for this one, that the original Manhatten was created in New York's Manhattan Club in or around 1880, give or take a few years. They were well known for their cellar of well-aged and delicious rye, so it seems like a pretty good fit. Here's the original recipe from Jerry Thomas's The Bartender's Guide. 2 dashes of curacao or maraschino, 1 pony of rye, a wine glass of vermouth, 3 dashes of bitters. Shake it and strain it into a glass and serve it with a 1/4 slice of lemon. So we're going to make a couple of substitutions here. We are going to use, in place of curacao or maraschino, which is a cherry liqueur, we're going to use cherry liqueur from Hotel Tango. You could use Cointreau or triple sec if you wanted an orange flavor as opposed to a cherry flavor. We're also going to use Angostura bitters as opposed to Boker's bitters because that's what I have. And you can use sweet vermouth or red vermouth or dry or green vermouth. We're going to start off with our bitters. Put those there. And then we're going to add our dash of cherry cordial or cherry liqueur. And then we're going to add our rye. So pony is 1 ounce. And then we're going to add our vermouth. Now, people who drink Manhattans nowadays will probably notice that the proportion between vermouth and rye is almost opposite in this original cocktail. Vermouth, for those who don't know, is really just a fortified wine. So fortified often with extra sugar and then distilled or infused with botanicals. So we've got all the ingredients right here in our shaker. We do need a couple pieces of ice. This is just going to help us chill. Give it a shake. Just to chill those liquors, and pour it into our glass with a 1/4 slice of lemon. So this is the original and classic Manhatten. It is surprisingly smooth. You still get that wonderful spiciness of the rye, but everything is sort of subdued by that vermouth. So if you are a Manhattan drinker, I strongly urge you to try this classic recipe and see which you like more. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of Happy Hour History. Please join me next week when we are going to be using that cherry bounce that we mixed up in episode 2. If you haven't done that, you should get on that right now because you're going to want to make these cocktails. As always, I want to thank Hotel Tango for the donation of their product. We are happy to support them and drink local in these times when local is so important. Keep it safe out there, and cheers. That's delicious. Oh, yeah.